It's my pleasure this morning to welcome Dr. Dalia Wassner to our breakfast. She is the director of Jews of the Americas, an initiative of Brandeis University at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. Dr. Wassner is a historian whose research and teaching is dedicated to providing more inclusive and interdisciplinary approaches to the Jewish diaspora and broadening the academic fields of Jewish studies, Latin American studies, and diaspora studies. Dr. Wassner is the author of Harbinger of Modernity, Marcos Aquinas, and the Democratization of Argentina, the mouthful, which illuminates the intersecting roles of Jews and public intellectuals in bringing democracy to post-dictatorship Argentina. She is a guest editor of the journal Latin American Jewish Studies, and her scholarships have been published in numerous academic journals, including Latin American Research Review, Iberian and Latin American Studies, Contemporary Jewry, and the Journal of Modern Jewish Studies. Dr. Wassner serves on the Latin American Jewish Studies Association Board of Directors, the Jewish Women's Archive Encyclopedia Editorial Board in the field of Latin America, and the Association for the Social and Scientific Study of Jewry on the Board of Directors. She has taught at Northeastern University, Emerson College, and Lesley University, speaking to us this morning on Cuban Jewish Memoir, a portal to the early Sephardim of the Americas. Please give a warm Brotherhood welcome to Dr. Dalia Wassner.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure already for me to be here this morning, and I'm excited to have a chance to talk to you about the early Sephardim of the Americas, and to share with you a memoir that I've come across in some of my current research that was written in 1954 in Cuba by a descendant of one of these early Sephardic Jewish families that came to the Americas. So first, just to give you a little bit more of a background, this is a new initiative at the university at Brandeis. It's called the Jews of the Americas. And the idea is, when we think of American, we think of U.S., and it's a term that's used all the time, like American, even North American. People conflate Canada and the U.S. even before this administration, and think that if you say North American, you're really talking about people from the U.S. and basically the Canadians who are sort of like us. Mexico, it turns out, is also part of North America, the Americas are much more connected than people often think. I, of course, am a historian by training, so I have dedicated my professional career to study the connections between different regions, and as a Latin American Jewish historian, I always seek those topics. So I wanted to share a little bit today with you, and I'm so grateful for the warm welcome, and it's been so nice to meet so many of you already, and hopefully in the Q&A, maybe I can learn some more of your names, and we can engage further. For our talk today, I thought, like I said, that I might share some of my current research. The memoir that you see on the corner there of the first slide says, Memoir and Related Observations by Jacob Brandon. And the author is a descendant of somewhere between 40 and 150,000 Jews that fled Spain and Portugal. And the reason that that number is so vast, we know it's tens of thousands, is that many had been converted to Christianity, either forcefully or duplicitly, maybe in name only, and then maybe fled other places where, depending on if they could reclaim or not their Jewish life, and if they were interested in that, they could. But there was a mass expulsion of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, and some of them who maintained their Jewish observance and religion overtly moved to Amsterdam. So if you've ever had a chance to travel to Amsterdam, you may know it as a strongly Sephardic Jewish community. If you've been to Anu, which is the new name of the Jewish people, the Museum of the Jewish People of the Diaspora, something like that at Tel Aviv University, you would see a model of the Amsterdam synagogue, and you could hear all about the legacy of the Sephardic traditions and its construction. So anyways, Jack Brandon Maduro, who wrote this memoir in Cuba in 1954, is a descendant of a family that fled from Spain to Amsterdam, and then was part of the first families of the Americas that were Jewish, because his ancestors immigrated to the Dutch West Indies, specifically Curacao. And next year, I'm working with some communities in the university to plan a commemorative event of 375 years of continuous life of Jewish life in the Americas, focusing on Curacao. So stay tuned for that. Maybe I'll have a way to let you know about that event if that happens. I'm hoping next spring. So anyhow, his family moves to Curacao in the 1600s. And I was shown by a descendant of the family tree, when I first started my research. And long story short is that a version of this is now gifted to the Brandeis Initiative on the Jews of the Americas and held at our offices now at Brandeis, and is shared with the library as well. And this is a direct family tree that traces the grandson who wrote the memoir all the way to the first ancestors of his family to arrive in Curacao. And so that is the history that I'm talking about when I'm saying that there were tens of thousands of Jews that left the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th century, at the end of the 1400s. Some of them, not all, but his family moved to Amsterdam, and from Amsterdam to Curacao. So I just wanted to give you that kind of background. And I say all this so that we consider sort of the networks that are implicated in migrations. How do migrating Jews tell their stories? How do these stories take new form through different migrations and also next generation? So the family of Jacob Brandon Maduro moves from Curacao to Panama in the mid-1800s. The author is born in 1880 in Panama, before Panama had separated from Gran Colombia. And that is related to the building of the Panama Canal. And we can get into that history of how Panama becomes independent of Colombia with the help of the U.S. that then got control of the Panama Canal, at least for 100 years. And so his family is among those founding Jewish families of the Panamanian Jewish community, but also the country of Panama, because they were there before the country was founded. So the father of Jack Brandon Maduro was named David Henry Brandon, and he founded the first fire station in Panama. And when there was a huge, very famous fire in Panama City, he was on the streets helping combat the fire and save people, and was so beloved for his contributions to just his country in general, that he is the only Jew for whom the cathedral bells of the country, main cathedral, have rung at his funeral. And I have that in sources documented, and every interview that I did that touched upon Jack Brandon Maduro's family mentioned the cathedral bells ringing in Panama for his father, David Henry Brandon. Okay? So I tell you, these are just little pieces to let you see how Jews in the Americas have been part of the fabric of society, and how there have been migrations even within the Americas to bring us a memoir that was written in 1954 in Cuba by someone who might have been actually confused to have been a U.S. Jew, because Jacob Brandon Maduro actually moves to New York as a young man, is educated in New York, is sent to work with his cousin Isaac at Isaac Brandon and Brothers banking family in New York. He doesn't like banking. He prefers to be in the schmata business, and so he then starts going back across the Atlantic to find his sources for hosiery. Is that how you say it? See, there's words I don't know how to say either. Like socks and hosiery, and other cloth and stuff like that. So that becomes his trade. And Jack Brandon then, after about 20 years in the States, in the 1920s, moves to Cuba, as a lot of most of the first Jews of Cuba were actually Jews from the U.S. that moved because it was an economic opportunity after the independence of Cuba from Spain. At that point, it was legal to be outwardly Jewish in Cuba because it was no longer an Iberian colony. Cuba was the last Spanish colony to fall, by the way. And with that, Spain loses not only Cuba, but also the Philippines and also Guam. And so it's called the Spanish-American War, but it's really also Cuba's war for independence. Fun fact, isn't it fun to be a historian? So I hope you're following all of these different tracks. But basically, in that tree, you see Jack Brandon Maduro tracing his lineage back 14 generations to Spain. And on that tree are Jack's grandson and great-granddaughter, also, who I know and live in New England. I guess it's hard to see a little bit, but that picture on your left is Jack. And these are different writings that I've come across, aside from his memoir. So he was a businessman by trade, but a frustrated journalist and academic and writer. And so he has writings of prose and poetry that also the family has entrusted us at the Jews as a Brandeis with. And so I just wanted you to know that we're looking at one source, which is his memoir, but it's part of a life's work of love of the pen. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background also as a historian of modern Jewry. Often you're taught about the Haskalah. Has anybody heard of the Haskalah, the Enlightenment in Europe, in Western Europe? This idea, if you've heard of Moses Mendelssohn, who wrote in favor of your religion is now going to be a private element of your identity, and the public part of you is a citizen, and that's the part that is shared with others. So this phrase, if you've heard, to be a Jew at home and a man on the street, that comes from that idea that we are all citizens that should participate politically and economically and socially as equals with everybody else, regardless of their religion, and have rights that are ascribed to us based on our common humanity. So that is this idea of Jewish modernity, following this idea of the existence of modern nation states where people were not just subjects of the king, but also citizens of a democracy. And why should Jews also not be considered that way? And what is interesting is that there's a whole other field of modern Jewish studies that looks at Sephardic Jews that were useful to the governments in which they lived, in which, as mercantile families and part of networks that were spread across really not only the Atlantic but the Mediterranean basin, the Jews as a group got granted rights because they were useful to their host countries or empires. And so I just wanted to put that kind of historical theory out there. It's called court Jewry modernity, and that's a new way of studying kind of the entrance of Jews into modern structures. Okay, so let's get to Jack Brandon Maduro. He's born in the Republic of Panama on August 4th, 1880. Again, like I told you, it was then part of Gran Colombia. And he's educated, like I said, in New York at Dr. Fax Collegiate Institute. And he remembers from his childhood in Panama that they would have Friday night dinners religiously at his grandmother Maduro's home, in which every member of the family that was currently in Panama would never miss, was never absent to that Friday night dinner. And the memoir begins by chronicling Jacob's family's business in Panama, and like I said, his father David's respect that he garnered among Jews and non-Jews alike. So David Henry Brandon is Jack's father. And I was lucky to be able to, 2 Januaries ago, travel to Panama with his great-grandson, who is photographed in the middle, at the fire station that his great-grandfather founded. That is a picture of him. I'm sorry, it comes from his camera, but with the permission of his grandfather, that is hanging today still at the fire station. And he was such an important figure that he was also, there was a stamp made for him. So that's a stamp of Panama with David Henry Brandon's image, which is Jack's father. And that is, we went to the cemetery, and the family has its own area of the cemetery. And that just shows you the family's presence in Panama. And if you look at the old cemetery of Panama, of the early Sephardi that came, many of the birthplaces of the first generation were Curacao and St. Thomas, mostly for Panama. And so you see, when you go to these places, the trajectory of the families. And suddenly, the 16 and 1700s aren't so far off for these family members. There you'll see documents. I went to the congregation in Panama City, where the documents from these communities are held. And these are just the tree is another version of the family tree that I have a more complete version that's now gifted to Brandeis. But there are many branches like this that are just part of the tree, or that intersect with certain members. And they have an entire library of treasure trove. So I hope to be able to raise the funds to bring students to actually study the archives. I just wanted to share them with you. Let's move to slide 6. So this is the letter that allows, and the sent to the U.S. government to apply for visas to go to Cuba, and then they end up moving in the 1920s. So we're now back to Jack Brandon and his wife Esther. They move in 1922 to Cuba, and that's where they'll live their entire lives. They'll have their 3 children, and they'll live for 30 years, only leaving in the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution, led by Fidel Castro. They leave in the months after the revolution in 1960, and the family legend has it that Jack actually, he did die on the train going from Miami to New York, and legend says that he died from a broken heart from having to leave Cuba, that he wasn't sick before, and that he was so distraught of having to leave Cuba. And so I wanted to share with you in the memoir, how does Jack write about Cuba? What is it like to be a Jew in Cuba? Do Jews belong in Cuba? Do they not belong? And how do they weave themselves into the history of the nation state, which is, again, pretty new, because independence was only 1898, okay? So here you see Jack talk about how Cuba is such a welcoming home for Jews. Up to this time, there's been no visible signs of anti-Semitism in Havana. We learned that the number of Jewish residents was small, and these were at first mostly of Sephardic origin, and I'll tell you a little bit about the history of Jews in Cuba as well. But what I wanted to focus on was that he says the language of these Sephardic Jews was Old Marrano, which we can go into what that means. It's really Ladino. similar to that which was spoken in the time of Cervantes, and which the Cubans seemed to enjoy hearing. The English-speaking and Sephardic Jews did not enjoy the dissonant note that the Yiddish Jews had brought, and we'll learn about when the Ashkenazi Jews come to Cuba. And the importance of this is that from the beginning, we see that the authentication of Sephardic Jews in Spanish or past Spanish lands is, we come from a similar past. We have the same language. The Cubans like to hear our language as well because it reminds them of something that's familiar to them. What's interesting is that Jack and Esther, having lived in the U.S. for 20 years, actually moved to Cuba and formed part of the U.S. Jews, English-speaking Jewish community in Cuba, because the first Jews that moved to Cuba are actually U.S. Jews that moved after the independence of Cuba from Spain. So this is another picture of Jack's life in Cuba. This is about 10 years after he moves, maybe 13. 1935. So what do we notice in the picture? There's a car. Car means wealth, right? They made it, success. How are they dressed? Nicely. And they're in front of a dwelling that looks lovely, correct? Like they have made it. And I wanted to share that with you. And I shared one quote before, and up there it says also that he's been there for 25 years. So that quote is from later than the picture, but I wanted to show you it in conjunction. And he writes about the people of Cuba. He says, Jack has found the people of Cuba, rich and poor alike, to be liberal-minded, friendly towards those who make a reasonable effort to understand them and work with them harmoniously. He says, Cuba is a matchless land in many ways. It has magnanimous soil, a salubrious climate, is free of poisonous flora and dangerous fauna, something which cannot be said of very many countries on earth. And he also writes that after 30 years of living in the country, because of course he writes the memoir in 1954, he is grateful for the lives that his family was able to enjoy there, that he raised his 3 kids in Cuba, and that he and his family have achieved some degree of social and cultural distinction. So Jack is thriving in Cuba. He's happy, his family is prospering, and he does talk a little bit about how the local society doesn't like to hear the Yiddish that some of the Ashkenazi Jews are starting to bring in. But what is interesting is that Jack doesn't, while he is reflecting some of the Sephardic Ashkenazi friction, when it comes down to it, he becomes a champion of helping some refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe arrive to Cuba, and some of them find a way actually to the U.S. also. In 1937, he becomes the chair of the an organization that's funded by the Joint Distribution Committee that's called the Jewish Relief Committee. And I just had a meeting with the chair of the archives this week, and she is showing me these documents in which Jack is advocating for the importance of helping these Jews that need to find refuge outside of Europe. And the U.S. has basically closed its door to Jewish immigration already, even before Kristallnacht, and is advocating for helping his Jewish brethren of Eastern Europe. So for the work actually that he did, he wins an award that's awarded to him in 1940 by the Cuban president at the time, called Federico Laredo Bru. It's the award is called Knight of the Order, or Caballero de la Orden. And he then starts his work actually as a leader of the Jewish community in Cuba that is focused on connecting the Jews of the Americas. He comes to New York, goes to New York, and meets with the director of Hillel and B'nai B'rith, and tells them how important it is for them to start chapters of B'nai B'rith and of Hillel in Cuba. Since he was the one that asked the question, he becomes the de facto leader of the Maimonides Lodge, which is the first B'nai B'rith lodge in Cuba. I'm sure you don't know what that's about here in the Brotherhood. If you have a good idea, you end up probably leading it. And so there's a lot in his memoir that reflects that same kind of vision, that we are all connected. We need to be involved in saving Jews from Europe, and also he's very focused on the Jews of the Americas being brought together and having organizations that cross into the Caribbean and that connect U.S. Jews not only with Caribbean Jews but also with Central and South American Jews. There you see some more pictures of Jack and his happy family life in Cuba. I'm a cultural and intellectual historian, which means I'm always interested in how the subjects that I study understand their own place in history. How do they narrate what they're doing? And what I noticed in the memoir is that he quotes the Monroe Doctrine, which was first enunciated in 1820, but then made famous after 1850. What do the Monroe Doctrine say, basically? Does anybody know? They likes U.S. history.
Non-intervention of foreign powers in the hemisphere.
Beautiful. So everyone here, non-intervention of foreign powers in the hemisphere. And who was going to protect that the hemisphere became stayed intact? The United States, right? It wasn't like an equal partnership, like let's all come together and make sure we each defend against. It's the U.S. is going to be like the big brother, right? And this was in a view to help the U.S. establish itself as kind of the defendant and the leader of the Americas against the bloc that is that was controlled by Europe, okay, and its colonial interests in other places in the world. So Monroe was often cited as, in the U.S. in the early 1900s, as the idea that the U.S. needs to take care of itself, okay? What's interesting is that Jose Marti was a Cuban hero. And he was a statesman and a writer and a friend of the Jews. And he admired how the Jews had survived over so many generations of being persecuted. And he, during the Cuban War for Independence, actually moves to New York and becomes friends with Jews in New York and receives funding to help support not the revolution, which is Castro's revolution in 1960, but the independence, which is called the Spanish-American War, but it's really also the war for Cuba's independence. And Jose Marti talks about the Americas being intact in a very different way. He says, we need to be proud of who we are in Cuba as Americans, as native to this land, as Cubans that don't need to always look to the Greek and to the Europeans and, other cultures as being superior, but we can be proud of what's indigenous to this land and also be proud of what we've learned from those that have come to our lands. Like, both are valid. And so he talks about nuestra America, our America, in a different way than Monroe talked about it. And what is so interesting is that Jack cites them both. So this is the Monroe Doctrine. I put it up there because I like history. This is an excerpt from Our America, 1891. So this is written over 50 years later than Monroe's, but around the same time that it's popular. He says, the greatest need of our America is to unite in spirit. The scorn of our strong neighbor, the United States, is the greatest present danger to our America. A new generation shapes our continent. So I wanted to share the fact that Jack, in his memoir, cites both Monroe and Marti, who have very different agendas, to talk about why the Americas need to come together, as if there's no conflict between them. Like in the US, we see this, and also Marti, who's a great Cuban leader, says this, and says like UNESCO's after World War II has created a World Heritage Site also in Cuba, and this just shows how, like, in order to fight for civilization and against despotism in the whole world. The Americas need to come together, and Cuba is an important part of that. And we need to bring Jewish communities together throughout all of the Americas. And this is cohesive and coherent to both U.S. ideas and also Cuban and the Americas. And so I just wanted to show you some of the arguments that he's included, and it is internally consistent to this idea of the Americas need to stick together. Does that make sense? So I thought that was pretty cool. This is before a lot of the like post-colonial and settler and all this stuff. It's just what are the common conversations and what are the refrains that people are using. So basically, here I wanted to show you an excerpt of a speech that he gives in 1949. So this is after the end of World War II. And he is given an award by B'nai B'rith, and it's hosted also by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League in Florida. And he's given a great award for his work in bringing B'nai B'rith to Cuba. Here, he writes, if you've studied Jose Marti, who writes about the glory of Cuba and the indigenous, not only population, but fauna, you'll see the resonance there. So this is just a little bit more of what I was saying before. He's writing in the pen of Marti, I think. So this meeting is held at the Delano Hotel. The ostensive purpose of this, or the stated purpose, is to promote interest in inter-American understanding. And it's the invitation is through both B'nai B'rith and the Anti-Defamation League, and the then president, Mr. Balkin of the Anti-Defamation League, gives the introductory address. Jack's writings are also featured here, his miscellaneous writings that I showed you. And so you see this man who is a businessman who has dedicated his life to trade, not unlike his ancestors, that was cross-Atlantic and depended on ethnic networks of Sephardic Jews that he was related to, is now bringing B'nai B'rith to Cuba and is being recognized in the U.S. for his work in promoting interest in inter-American understanding. Okay? There you have his speech, which he copies and he inserts into his memoir directly, and you have some of that same language. That is a final picture that the memoir shows of his family in Cuba from the year the memoir was completed, which is 1954, and an ode of gratitude to this country that became his new home and that he never expected or planned to leave. And he expected to live his life in Cuba. And of course, as I told you, he ended up leaving right after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, just a few months later, and died on the train from Miami to New York. And all members of his family that I have spoken to will tell me that he died on that train and let me know that he died of a broken heart, that that's the way the family understood it. So I wanted to show you a memoir of a Jew that lived in Cuba, but we were talking about knowing the history in a deep way behind, who are the Jews of Cuba. And he actually was part of the U.S. Jewish community because he lived first in New York for 20 years. I'm going to tell you, and I'll wrap up soon, I just wanted to give you a little bit of facts on the Jews of Cuba. I was saying I led a trip there last spring, almost exactly a year ago, met with members and safekeepers of the legacy of the Jews of Cuba, because now it's really what remains of the Jews that were once in Cuba. And I can speak more of that in the Q&A. Like I said, the first practicing Jews in Cuba were actually U.S. expats who moved to the island after 1898, which is when Cuba becomes independent of Spain. And they moved mostly for economic opportunities. Soon after, modern Sephardim end up immigrating, especially in 1909. We see immigration from the Ottoman Empire of the Sephardim that were still on the other side of the Atlantic, that because if you've heard of the Young Turk in the Ottoman Empire, they were imposing compulsory military service. So you have a lot of Sephardim that left Turkey, or what became Turkey at that time. Some of them came to Cuba. At first, they worked as peddlers, peddling things like bedding, clothing, shoes, small household wares. And they also would bring these to the sugar refineries that were outside of Havana or to market towns. And most of these did very well. They arrived with very little, but within a generation, they were able to build a decent life for themselves, even higher up. You also have Syrian Jews who move to Cuba, and then many of them move on from Mexico or New York. But in the 1920s, 25% of Cuban Jews were of Syrian descent. And the Ashkenazim that came to Cuba came mostly after 1921, so after World War I. And it coincided with the U.S. cracking down on immigration of people from Eastern Europe. There was a loophole for a few years that if you spent a year in an adjacent country, you could then move to the U.S. In 1924, the U.S. noticed that loophole, closed it, and essentially you started to have people stay in Cuba that initially intended to move on beyond it. It was called Hotel Cuba because you would just stay among certain Jews. You would just stay there for a time, and then it was known that you would move on. In fact, they said that most Cuban Jews were writers because they were always writing to their relatives in the U.S. to see if they can get them there. But then in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the Cuban Jews that stayed, by and large, made a good life for themselves. And Cuba really became home. Eastern European Jews founded trade unions. Many of them that came in the 1920s were socialists. There were 8 trade unions, including for shoemakers, peddlers, barbers, street photographers, tailors, seltzer water vendors, merchants, and also after the war, diamond workers. So if anybody's ever heard of Cuba's Forgotten Jewels, it's a wonderful documentary that's owned by the National Center for Jewish Film. I've done events with them. Actually showed that before the trip to Cuba to the group that was coming. That talks about the whole diamond trade and how refugees were able to come under a certain visa for that. Anyhow, you have Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and also Mizrahi Jews, like the Syrian Jews that came coming to Cuba. And then you have people that become writers and engineers, professors, doctors. Really, they enter the professions. And what's interesting is that Marti becomes a favorite of Jewish writers, including there's a lot written about Marti and lauding Marti in Yiddish. So you could study the Yiddish press in Cuba and read Marti as a hero for Jews and non-Jewish Cubans alike. And I just wanted to bring that out. So to turn to statistics for a moment. Of the 25,000 Jews who entered Cuba between 1918 and 1947, half departed in the same period. On New Year's Eve, 1959, which is the eve of the Cuban Revolution led by Fidel Castro, Cuba's population generally was about 6 million people, of which a generous estimate is 15,000 of them were Jews. And at that point, you had most of them comprised of Ashkenazi Jews with an important section that were Sephardic Jews from Turkey. And also there was a small upper middle class from the U.S., which included Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews. Patronato was the main Jewish community center of Cuba. And it was built in the 1950s. It was called the Patronato de la Casa de la Comunidad Hebrea de Cuba. And it's the building that's all the way on the left, on the top. That's my photo from last year when I went. All of these are my pictures from the trip. And that is 100 years of celebrating Jewish life in Cuba, although there were Jews a little bit before 1906 too. And it cost $750,000 in 54 to build the Patronato, which then was a huge amount of money. It still is now, but it was even more so then. And the Jewish community was prosperous enough to support that. We see in the early bulletins of the congregation also that young women and young men of the community are being congratulated for their recent degree in their medical field or in engineering or in architecture. Like their young people are really making it in Cuba. And also importantly, when you read accounts of Jews that lived in Cuba throughout the 1960s and after, actually, there's emphatic kind of statements that there's no anti-Semitism in Cuba. And I think that is not shared in other places. Argentina has basically like the only pogrom in Latin America in 1919. We can talk about it, but in Cuba, we can talk about why that is, but there's a lot of reflection that there was no anti-Semitism. So the Jews of Cuba really lived in such a way that they became prosperous, even though most came without anything. And within one generation, they entered the middle class. They were able to buy a family home. Their children were able to go to school, enter professions, and make a life for themselves. So these were success stories. Okay, and people, of course, always like to ask about, especially the Eastern European Jews that came in the 1920s. Many of them were socialists. They formed these labor unions. Were they also in Castro's circle? And yes, of course, we have the famous Jews that supported Castro, but the truth is that many of even Eastern European descendant Jews, a generation or two after they moved, had also moved into the middle class in Cuba. And it wasn't the same fight, actually, as in Eastern Europe. It wasn't totally translatable. But you have people like Enrique Olbulski Osaki, who served in the First Revolution cabinet. You have a Polish Jew named Fabio Grobart, who became an advisor to Fidel Castro. He was called Fabio Grobart in Cuba, but he was born Junger Sendrovich. He arrives in Cuba at the age of 19 and does commit himself to Cuba's liberation. He helps found the Communist Party in 1925, and in 1965 is elected to the Central Committee, and he holds this for 30 years until his death in 1994, and he was always the one that introduced Fidel Castro at any party meeting, and Fidel famously called Grobart el Polaquito, which means like the little Polish guy, and it was reflected that Grobart was short and Fidel, of course, was tall, and so the pictures that you see of them embracing is like Fidel towering over the little Pole. But most of these Jews that are cited as being involved in the Communist Party, especially under Fidel, were pretty disconnected from the rest of the Jewish community that was active and that was affiliated in Cuba. So even if they came from a Jewish descent, like, for example, Claudia Sheinbaum, always ask me about her, we can talk about it, the current president of Mexico. Yes, she's Jewish, but in her case, that's not, it wasn't a meaningful identity ever for her, as far as we know. Okay, so maybe just as a very, very last topic, and we're basically at the end here, Jews and Jewry under Castro, because this is something that I'm asked about often. So it turns out that the idea to restructure Cuba's economy on socialist lines also deprived the Jewish immigrants of the businesses they worked so hard to build. In addition, Cuban Jews did have family often in the U.S., and the close relationship between Cuban Jews and U.S. Jews by 1962 seemed very dangerous in terms of U.S.-Cuban relations. And so after just 6 years, so I guess in 1960, so the Patronato was founded in 1954. You have 95% of the Jews of Cuba leave Cuba within 3 years, between 1960 and 1963. And the Patronato is basically empty. And while Judaism isn't outlawed per se, it's of note that Jews were allowed to maintain a kosher butcher, and their synagogues were not outlawed. Most of the Jews had moved away, and you have to be very careful. It's not always so clear cut of like, yes, it's permitted, but you were not encouraged to say that you were Jewish, or to have a meaningful relationship. And basically, it was only in 1992, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and when basically the Soviet Union stops existing and being the number one patron of Cuba, that Cuba allows these missions to come and to support the Jews of Cuba. So you have the Joint Distribution Committee sending matzah on Passover, and also aid, and also rabbis. And so I'm in touch with the current rabbi of Cuba. There are a few that are local, but I'm not sure if they ever trained actually formally. But the one that is acknowledged by most as the head rabbi is most of the time living in Chile, but comes about 3 months a year to Cuba to serve in those functions. So before I close, I just wanted to offer you a reflection from Cuban anthropologist. These are more statistics that I included. I think this is what happened to the Jews of Cuba. Can you all read? Do you want me to read it for you, or you're good?
You can all read it.
You can all read it. The Cuban American anthropologist Ruth Behar, who, by the way, is the first Latina to ever win the MacArthur Fellowship for her work in anthropology, she herself began to dedicate a lot of her professional work to discovering what happened to the Jews of Cuba after 1960. And she left when she was 5 years old, like most middle class Jews left in the early 1960s. Her family immigrates to New York, not to Miami. And what she does is kind of a trademark anthropological work that she is known for, is that she goes back to a place where there was a certain history that was lived in that place, but that has obviously changed drastically, especially in Cuba, and shows the people that remain the pictures from a different time, and have them relate to, like, what does this mean, especially when you have a dramatic change in circumstances. So the fact that over 90% of the Jews of Cuba left, well, what does it mean for those that remained? What does it mean when they look back at pictures that were taken maybe at the patronato of bar mitzvahs and weddings and Hanukkah celebrations, for the ones that stayed? There's a great book called An Island Called Home by Ruth Behar, which is a photojournalistic book that this is taken from. So I wanted to share that element of, like, what happens to the Jews of Cuba today and what do we do with that. The next slide is also from her, that basically says, why should US Jews, American Jews, care about Jews in other places? And she reflects that in modern times, contemporary times, we often think of Jews as living in the US and Israel, and that these are based, and that those Jews have come from other places in the world, that this is basically like the center in diaspora. And what happens if we shift our understanding of American Jewry and world Jewry to include places like Cuba and Argentina and Mexico? And of course, I have built a center dedicated to this, so I'm obviously of the opinion that when we broaden our notion of American Jewry, it's not just about including other stories, but I do think it changes how we think of ourselves in the world, and Jewish people as a global people with deep histories that connect us in more ways than we might assume. So I'm happy to open for questions. I'm sorry if that went too long for them.
Hi, yeah, interesting talk.
Thank you.
I was thinking about marriages in the sense that did they always Jews marry other Jews during this time, or did they marry people of other faiths?
So before 1960, it was most common not only for Jews to marry other Jews, but actually for Sephardic Jews to marry Sephardic Jews, and for Ashkenazi Jews to marry Ashkenazi Jews, and for the American Jews, the U.S. Jews in Cuba, were pretty separate actually among their community. So Ruth's parents, for example, was like a scandalous intermarriage because her mother is Sephardic and her father is Ashkenazi, or maybe the other way around. After the 1960s, when most Jews left, those that remained, the Jewish community, for example, that remains in Cuba now is mostly descendant from intermarried. marriages because of the demographics. But before, most were not intermarried.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Morning.
Good morning.
Couple of comments and then really a question. But I found it interesting when you talked about the Cuban Jews who were originally there. And then the Ashkenazi, the Eastern Europeans, started to come in and they were speaking Yiddish. And the original Jews looked down on that.
Yeah.
The fact is, my understanding is that's very much the same with the German Jews who came to the U.S. And then the Eastern European Jews came, and they came out of the shtetls,
Yeah.
and the German Jews were embarrassed by it. But the real question I have is, I'm a little confused on the dating that you were using. 1492 was the era of the Spanish Inquisition, and you weren't clear, at least to me, as to whether the Exodus you were referring to in Spain is beginning with the Inquisition.
I think especially German Jews in the U.S., there was also a class notion. And so German Jews were seen as more educated or saw themselves as more educated in culture. And they also didn't want to be, to lose a level of acceptance that they had gained by being associated with their less uncouth, brethren. And or seeing them as a burden also on American society. And so they were going to make sure to take care of their own and make sure that they stay on the Lower East Side. So yes, in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, you have the mass exodus of Jews from Spain, and then a few years later from Portugal. There was an inquisition that was in place for over actually a century, even before that was established in order to identify those secret Jews that were threatening the pure Spanish blood. And many had undergone conversions. There were some forced conversions, both in Spain and in Portugal, famously, for those Jews that had stayed. And after 1492 in Spain, it became illegal to be Jewish. The Inquisition carried on, obviously, finding those that were imposters. And so there were many that left even before 1492. But what's interesting is that from the same ports that you have the expeditions leading to the Americas, well, to India, you also had boats full of Jews leaving the Iberian Peninsula to go to places like Amsterdam, but also the Mediterranean basin, Italy, places like that.
Just to follow up,
Yeah.
I think I recently read, as far as the Inquisition goes,
Yeah.
that they just, within the past few years, if not even more recent, officially closed it, so to speak. Whatever the laws were, they officially removed them from the books, which
Yeah.
is pretty long time, really, 500 years.
Yeah. You're right. In 1984, I think, or 86, something like that.
The other thing I was just curious about is I've read where there were rumors that either Columbus was Jewish or partly Jewish, in that some of his crewmen were Jewish. And it was rumored, again, following that he was working with the Jews who were leaving Spain because of the Inquisition at that time. Can you comment on that?
Yes. So there's a lot of debate on whether Columbus himself was he or was he not himself a secret Jew. And I think the jury is still out as far as, it's not something that I researched personally, but my colleagues, I think the jury is still out as far as I know, although there are people that are very emphatic that they do insist that that is true. What we do know is that funders of the expedition, some of those that were high up in the treasury in Spain and Portugal, were new Christians. And so what you might have in a family is, one brother or a cousin or an uncle. You could have one be a Jew that immigrated to Amsterdam in 1480. Still practicing Jew, and then somebody that converts and becomes a new Christian, meaning that, so there's these terms which I can define: new Christian, secret Jew, converso marrano. But in the same family, you can have those that maintain their Judaism secretly, but they still consider themselves Jewish in a secret way that is not shared, because of course it's dangerous to do so. There are those that convert and intend to become Christians, and then there's those that leave and stay practicing Jews other places, and those can be within the same family, and often were. And so we definitely know that part of the funds that did fund the expeditions were organized by new Christians. And we know, for example, for sure that Columbus's translator, Luis de Torres, was one of those secret Jews. And why was he commissioned to go as a translator? Because he knew Aramaic and he knew Hebrew and he knew languages that were considered to be connected to ancient civilizations. So it would be useful to have him on a trip. So yeah, and we know that there were secret Jews that came on these expeditions, not only to the U.S., but to other parts of the Americas. There's an article in the Atlantic that says that 25% of Latin Americans can trace their ancestry to Jewish roots because so many left that sought a new world. There's a great novel that I love to recommend. It's a novel that's fiction, but that it has some this is based on historical facts that is deeply researched by Mary Morris called Gateway to the Moon that I love. I did an event with her. So yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for bringing attention to the Jews of Latin America. My grandfather was born in Poland. He tries to come to America after 1924. I think it was like 1927. He was caught up in the ban of Jews from Eastern Europe. He can only go to Mexico. So he learned Spanish before English. He ended up actually going to Puerto Rico to make a business, and so my family also moved to Puerto Rico in 1973. And I just wanted to, make a comment that there were two synagogues in Puerto Rico. There was a conservative that was mostly Cuban Jews, maybe 200 families, and then nobody spoke English. They spoke Spanish and Yiddish. And my family belonged to an Ashkenazi temple in Puerto Rico called Temple Beth Shalom. We only had 40 families there. And so I just wanted to bring attention to the fact that some of the Jews after the revolution in Cuba came over to Puerto Rico. Yeah. And they actually became very successful there. Yeah.
That's fantastic to know. Yes, and so you'll see if you bring up this topic that people will share these types of stories, which I think again, just reiterate how people that were coming to the U.S. really came to the Americas and are part of these stories in other islands or nations.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm just curious, the people that arrived, let's say in Cuba or other parts of the Americas, when they came, I imagine they arrived destitute, but were these skilled people that used to own businesses in general, and that's why they quickly became successful, or were they, the shtetl Jews without any real skills?
So it's hard to generalize, but I think that many people that arrived destitute and became peddlers. There's a book actually by Hasia Diner, I think called Peddling Across the Americas or something like that connects from the U.S. all the way to South America. I think by and large we don't have the German immigrants that come with professions and wealth already. But they were very hardworking, and in societies where, especially in the early 1900s, if you worked hard, many of them became destitute and became successful, at least middle class. Some of them became very, very wealthy, and they were able to take advantage of economic opportunities that were open to them. But mostly really pull themselves up from their bootstraps, coming with nothing. I can tell you my own grandmother came to Mexico as a 2-year-old, and for her wedding, when she was 18, her mother told her, I could either buy you a wedding dress or a stove, and she chose the wedding dress. And when I was 16, I thought, how frivolous, you know. But if you ever tasted my grandmother's cooking and you saw her fashion, you would see that she chose true to herself. Very fashionable lady was much more in her skill set. But she said to me, she said, I thought one day, hopefully, I would own a stove, but I'll never wear a wedding dress again.
Yeah.
And then they became founders of the Jewish community in Mexico City that built the institutions that became, leaders of, Jewish organizations as well. And that's a common story, that those were not like the one success story.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Wassner.
Thank you so much. Pleasure. Thanks for welcoming me.